government and open data background, I wanted to see the way AI is managed beyond the technology itself. So then I began examining AI funding. A lot of money is going into AI, and this isn't just Canada, it's global. But in Canada, we see it at multiple levels. And this is the work that I'm currently doing is really public sector funding. As we all know, private sector funding is a lot harder and way more opaque to analyze. So billions in funding have been committed. By August of this year, 1.1 billion in government contributions have been awarded across Canada. And this also includes 1.3 billion that have been publicly announced for Quebec, and in Montreal, where I usually am, over 2 billion in private investments has been reported. As we can see around the world, we have these new Silicon Valleys forming. So why open government and financial data? So the availability of open government data and also the accessibility is really key to understanding AI funding. So this is important because we can search for government grants and contributions, government contracts on the open data portal. So within Canada is really fortunate to have this data available as a starting point. However, it's still important to note that the public still cannot easily find this information on AI procurement specifically. And this includes, when I say the public, it means the average person, but also anyone doing policy work, digital rights work, or academic journalists, and also journalists. Who funds leads? And this is really important because moving from Canada onto the world scene, we see geopolitics at play. The global AI race is supporting the technology innovation economy, as we've seen massive investments from China, US, Singapore, UK, and France, to just name a few. But funding is important because it's really about power and control, but it's also about opacity. And this is how the status quo maintains that power and control. So in this, it's really about the opacity that is not only found in the technology itself. As we know, AI can be not only problematic, but also deeply opaque, but it's also in the funding networks that it has. And I'm only, again, touching around public sector funding. Private sector funding is even more inherently opaque. So there is concern over how AI is governed in the way that it is funded. An AI industry is really being built without taking into account human rights and collective rights. So why is this important? Well, AI technologies have caused and continue to cause harm and exacerbate structural bias towards race, gender, and more. And scholars Timnit Gebru, Joy Bolamwini, and Deborah Raji's groundbreaking research, Gender Shades, reveals how IBM, Microsoft, and Face++ AI services guess the gender of a face accurately for lighter skin, but inaccurately for darker skin. And this is just one example. Many great scholars and authors have written about the issues with AI, racism, sexism, ableism, and its structural inequalities. I recommend reading their work, and also data feminism. So moving on towards the policy landscape and regulation, or maybe the lack of public regulation that we're currently at. So what we have now is not necessarily in AI and technology is not deregulation, it is private regulation, because technology is always catching up with law. I hope we can break this cycle, but until then, this is what we have, which is self-regulation via internal ethics frameworks like this one, for example, which comes from Deloitte Canada's AI lab. So the important part of this is that when you look at it, at first glance, it looks inclusive. It includes justification, the ethos, the fairness, safety. You have these questions that are important to answer. But I would add a second layer of these questions, which is looking at decision makers. So who decides what to build, if it should be built, how to build, if it's built safely. And a step further could be around who actually funds this stuff and who decides when to fund and when not to fund. And this is why it's been always important to consider how, as Ruha Benjamin in Race After Technology has said, we should consider how private industry choices are in fact public policy decisions, and how these are a little bit intertwined with what happens at the government level. And so one example of public policy measures being taken for a more responsible AI is looking at best practice examples. So this is the Canadian government's algorithmic impact assessment. So the AIA is really a questionnaire made up of 60 questions for companies to answer on the business process, data, and system design decisions. It's for people who design and build AI systems. But as I've identified and found in my research, half of the pre-qualified AI suppliers for government have so far committed to the AIA. It is still not a legally binding process, and it's still in beta. So its real-world impact still needs to be seen if it really is if its goal is really about public accountability. So funding and financing are really intertwined. And what I've seen so far is that companies are only accountable to the government under the terms of their contract in specific countries. So only the government itself is directly accountable to the public, but not private sector. So AI principles, ethics frameworks, and algorithmic impact assessments are good as a starting point, but they aren't enough to facilitate accountability for companies. So the procurement of this technology can cause significant harm, including breaches to our fundamental freedoms. And the example I'm going to give you today is Palantir Technologies. So Palantir is a data analytics company. It's also an AI company. That's the beauty of AI. It can be many things, and that's also makes it hard to examine and explore at times. So Palantir has a known track record for causing or contributing to human rights abuses. And in the latest report, Amnesty USA stated that the US Palantir software created for the US Department of Homeland Security as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, enabled the government to identify, share information about, investigate, and track migrants and asylum seekers to effect arrests and workplace raids. So this is one example. There are many more. Palantir has partnered with many governments around the world and also with UN organizations such as the World Food Programme. And in Canada, Palantir operates as Palantir Technologies Canada with its own internal ethics framework, and it also commits to the AIA to build responsible software for government. So there's a lot of siloing in what happens on a country per country basis, rather than looking at companies as a global entity and seeing how it has been problematic, continues to be problematic, and maybe shouldn't be funded or awarded contracts. So how do we prioritize public over private accountability when funding AI? I will answer that question with another question, which is, how do we confront what is captured? And what I mean by captured is either corporate capture or state capture. So what I have seen a lot in Canada is people being concerned about corporate capture. So really having this influence and making decision-making and power within public institutions that undermines human rights and the environment. What I've also heard is about the sort of global landscape of state capture from other countries, where you have political corruption, where private, where alongside public scrutiny and independent oversight over these mechanisms is really important, and it's what's needed. So we can have better public investments practices and their relationships. So that's a one way forward to move towards a public interest AI. But we also need to look towards international regulation about funding transparency in this field as well. Often corporate capture and state capture go together and aren't so separate either. So I just wanted to make a note on that. So what's next? Well, what we really currently have is private regulation, internal ethics frameworks, amongst other ethical principles in place. Where are we going? Towards algorithmic impact assessments, algorithmic auditing, and fairness certifications, and risk consulting, which are all very key. And what more can be done? I will focus a little bit more on this, as it can have that global international connections. So I really argue for international movements that actually connect to the national and the local. This is really about transparency, accountability, and public procurement, and we see this with open contracting unfolding around the world. And also it's about corporate transparency towards accountability with open ownership. So one way to do this is to create beneficial ownership within public registries of people who ultimately own, control, or benefit from a company. So this is not just companies' legal owners, as they can be different. So it's important to then take movements like this and use them to improve public consultation processes with government. And last but not least, whistleblower protections are needed for activists, for technology workers, for researchers working for big tech and beyond. As you might have heard of the Clearview AI example, that was the fact that we even found out which governments ended up using or procuring their systems was because of a data leak. Towards public accountability and funding AI means love and people over money, and public accountability over profit. So let's not forget that funding is political. So is the technology designed, built, procured, and used along with its data. There are many political layers to address.